Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us for today's book discussion hosted by the CSPS Center for Studies of Plural Societies. We are delighted to host a conversation that brings together scholars whose work deeply informs our understanding of South Asian histories, Muslim communities, gender migration, and the emotional intellectual worlds of print culture. At the center of today's discussion is Dr. Eve Tignol's remarkable book Grief and the Shape of Muslim Communities in Colonial North India, published by Cambridge University Press in 2023. It offers a moving exploration of how grief shaped religious, emotional, and political life among Muslim communities in colonial North India, opening new directions for thinking about the effective history of the subcontinent. Mr. Tignol is Dr. Tignol is a CNRS Research Fellow at EHESS Paris, and her work spans the history of emotions, conceptual history, and Urdu print cultures. Her current research explores gender and shame in Urdu periodicals of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We are honored to be joined by two distinguished scholars in conversation with her. Dr. Azima Salim, chair for today's discussion, is assistant professor at JK Lakshmipat University, Jaipur. Her research work focuses on forced migration, gender, and minority rights across South Asia, West Asia, and Europe. She is also affiliated with Islam and Liberty Network, Yale University's of AGAPE project, and CSPS Gender Studies Initiative. Dr. Sumaiyah Ahmed, our discussant, is assistant professor at Jamia Hamdard University, New Delhi. Her scholarship explores Islamic disclosures and women's roles in GCC societies, with a particular focus on education and empowerment. We are grateful to all three speakers for being here with us today. The format will include a presentation by Dr. Dignol, followed by reflections from Dr. Salim and Dr. Ahmed. We will then open the floor for questions. With that, I now invite Dr. Eve Tignol to begin the discussion and take us into the world of grief and the shaping of Muslim communities in colonial North India. Over to you, Dr. Tignol.
Thank you very much, all of you, for being here, and thank you, the CSPS, for inviting me to present the book. Can I just try to share my screen? I don't know if it's feasible. Let me do that. Okay. I'm sorry for this. Let me get that right. Okay, I'll try to. Does everyone see anything?
Yes, your screen visible.
Okay, good. Today I wanted to introduce a part of the monograph, which is really the revision of my PhD thesis. Between the thesis and the book, I revised quite a bit because during my PhD I was interested in how Urdu-speaking Ashraf remembered their past during after rather the uprising of 1857. But actually, when I reworked the thesis, I focused less on how the past was remembered and more on how it was invested with feeling. So I actually thought that it was the emotional dimension of memory that gave power to it, and hence I concentrated for the book on the emotion that most powerfully emerged in relation to the past in my source material, which is grief, gham. So the aim of the book is to characterize grief and document how diverse actors engaged with it and used it in a variety of contexts to understand how grief itself acted as a driving force in the history of British India. So how grief was effective. Um, let me just see how I can do it more efficiently because it's not as easy as I thought it would be. I will just save it as a PDF. Okay.
हम लोग बोलते कि भाई ये क्या शर्मा पांडे ये क्या मतलब आपसे कुछ नाम रखते हैं फिल्मों में जो सरनेम होते हैं वो हमेशा पूछी जाती
So, I'm sorry for this. I should have tried before. Let
Do you
me
want
see.
help regarding the sharing of screen?
I will just save it as a PDF because it will be easier for me to manage, I guess. But let me get this in the right place. Okay, yes. This might be easier. Yeah, so here, yeah. I think it's better for me. I'm sorry for this. So this question of how emotions can be effective is a relatively new question of historians. In the 1950s, you have social constructionism and the emergence of disciplines which question the traditional opposition between heart and reason, and this provided new ground for historical research. So until then, and Norbert Elias' work provides very good evidence, emotions were usually seen as primitive, as human instincts that had to be controlled and rationalized to bring about an advanced modern civilization. Now, with theories of social constructionism, emotions came to be understood as emerging and being maintained through interactions. So emotions are usually considered now by historians as being culturally embedded communicative practices. Emotions are communication. To say this doesn't mean that there's nothing innate in what we feel. And psychologists have shown that there's a number of basic universal emotions like sadness, anger, or fear. But anthropologists have also shown that even if they can be felt around the world, emotions are not everywhere the same. Moreover, as William Reddy has argued, emotional expressions are not mere descriptions, but are performative in nature. They do something. So, for instance, when you feel sadness, you first need to identify and label what you feel as sadness, which means that the cognitive and non cognitive processes are intertwined, and then you can express it. But to say, I am sad, is usually not insignificant. Saying it can reinforce your own feeling of sadness, and it can also, more importantly for us, elicit a response from whom you told. And that is what historians focus on, not only how emotions as cultural products transform across time, but also how they impact the turn of events. That, for some, has raised the question of sincerity. Are the emotions expressed those that were truly felt? And interestingly, this debate was also discussed in relation to Urdu literature in the 1990s, when there's a famous debate occurring between historian Ralph Russell and literature scholar Frances Pritchett about the use of Urdu poetry for historical research. So in her 1994 Nets of Awareness, Frances Pritchett claimed that any attempt to move from poetic imagery to social reality is destined to break down. Ralph Russell challenged this view, emphasizing the historical embeddedness of Urdu poetry, but he himself used the Urdu ghazal, a very, as you may all know already, a highly conventional form of poetry, to shed light on elements of poets' biography. And in this book, I do not resort to poetry to explain any specific aspect of its composer's life. And indeed, it might be difficult to do so, as Frances Pritchett highlighted, but I support the view that poetry, however conventional, is a reflection of the society that produces it. So then how to gauge the sincerity of poetic texts that are so constrained by convention? Can any genuine emotion be recovered from the Urdu ghazal, for instance? So for William Reddy, one answer is that sincerity is to be redefined in the case of performative emotional expressions. It matters less whether the emotion was truly felt, whatever it would mean, than whether the emotion creates an appropriate effect. So it's more about effects rather than affect, if we can say. Another response is that historians like Barbara Rosenwein have argued that unless the sources themselves worry about their own sincerity, we as historians need not worry about the sincerity. But the question of the sincerity of poetic emotions in Urdu literature partly stems from criticism of traditional poetry by Urdu poets of the New School in the late 19th century. They claimed that traditional poetry was artificial, false, and unnatural, and they promoted instead simplicity, sadgi, and truth, asliyat. And you see one of the main proponents of the new school here, Alta Hussein Khali, who, when he explained his project, he clearly stated that the inspiration of the poet was emotion, an emotion that the poet was to express so as to be useful. And here I've quoted some of his famous book of literary criticism, where he clearly states the importance of emotion, an emotion that the poet can express in language, but also that people listening to poetry are certainly affected by it. When poetry is effective, it can be very useful. So in fact, if Khali criticized the false emotions of his predecessors, he actually claimed that his emotions were true. So his statement actually is a statement of the sincerity of poetic emotions. And here we find the question of sincerity, which arises in my corpus, not because actors question their own emotions, which would be a very interesting problem. I would love to see that more often, but because they question the emotions of others. And this points to the delineation of clashing emotional expressions and the making of group distinctions. So in the book, I show how one emotion reflects a multiplicity of voices and practices. And I argue that grief is not just the emotion, the expression of particular groups, but are a proactive tool in the formation of those groups. So for the book, I've used a variety of sources produced by Urdu-speaking Ashraf, not only Muslims, but also Hindus, especially from the scribal castes like Kayas, Khatris, and Kashmiri Brahmins from 1857 to the 1940s. And most of the writing I've used borrowed from Sher Ashub aesthetics that can take the form of both prose and poetic texts. So today I wanted to focus on 3 specific moments in the history of North India to show you what an analysis of emotions can bring forth. The first will be about Sher Ashok poetry after 1857, just to give you a kind of background for the transformation of those Sher Ashok aesthetics. And then I will focus on 2 moments of controversy around public expressions of grief, one in the 1880s and the other one in the early 1910s. For the book, my analysis continued after the 1910s with a study of early 20th century memoirs of Delhi by Dehlavi Muslims at a time of heightened local communal conflicts, but I will not go into this today. First, I wanted to make a quick point on translation, because usually when talking about Urdu writings about the past and sadness, scholars have used nostalgia quite a bit. And I've chosen not to use nostalgia generally to translate Kham because nostalgia not easily translates into Urdu, and nostalgia traditionally evokes mental and physical illness, and it seemed really very much restrictive for most of my source material. So Kham in Urdu is a very broad term for sorrow, and it rarely appeared in isolation in the sources, but rather at the core of very rich semantic nods, which linked suffering, longing, loneliness, compassion, depression, lament, etc. So as you will see, I have remained very attentive to the very different semantic webs created around Kham. But the fact that in traditional Arabic and Persian treatises, sadness was closely tied to loss, and because of the link between grief and grievances in English, I've usually translated Kham as grief, but sometimes I vary my prose just depending on circumstances. So my first point is about the post-1857 Sher Ashok literature. And as you know, the uprising of 1857 and its aftermath as well is a watershed event in the history of colonial South Asia. Urdu-speaking elites particularly saw the world crumbling as quickly as the buildings around them. Many were imprisoned or publicly, often collectively executed. And the Muslims were expelled massively from Delhi, which was one of the epicenter of the uprising, and they were forced to leave their belongings and properties behind, which were confiscated by the British. North Indian cities were destroyed, and many of the finest Mughal monuments of Lahore, Agra, Lucknow, or Delhi were demolished or rehabilitated as chapels, hospitals, or military quarters. And it is in this context, 6 years after the uprising and 1 year after Muslims were finally readmitted into Delhi, that the poet Kokab published an anthology of poems on 1857 entitled Fukhan-e-Dehli, so the lament for Delhi. And it was composed of 59 Sher Ashobs by 38 different poets, all lamenting the devastation of Delhi and to a lesser extent Lucknow in 1857. It was most probably the result of a very vibrant culture of Sher Ashob's recitations, and the poets of the anthology evolved in the same literary milieu. So most were Muslim Ashraf of Delhi. Sometimes they were friends, sometimes even brothers, and there are a few Hindus as well, Khatri and Akayas. But they had all, they were from different generations, and they had all different experiences of the city. So all of the poems belong to the Sher Ashok genre. In Urdu, it's characterized by an emotion, sadness, and a topic, the city. But the genre was a readaptation of Turkish and Persian Sher Ashok, which used to praise a city by describing the positive uproar caused by its many beautiful, young, and often male citizens. So Sher Ashok meant city disturbers, those who disturb the city. And the genre ultimately aimed at praising the ruler, by describing a beautiful, cosmopolitan, and virtuous state. Now, from the 18th century, the genre was adapted in Urdu, and it completely changed. Because of the decline of Mughal power, poets resorted to the genre to describe the disarray of North Indian cities and to mock often the sovereign as well. And from describing the beautiful city disturbers, it really described the disturbed city. So you have a sort of inversion here. The poems of the 1857 collections pertained to this tradition, but I argued that it reached a climax of nostalgia by narrating even more than before a collective pain and culture rupture. So if we look attentively, the poem in fact adapted the genre in three main ways. So the first way was that they used the musaddas and the ghazal verse forms. So almost 90% of the poems are set in those forms. And this is really an innovation of 1857 poems. They used a style which was traditionally used for practices of mourning. So the musaddas, as you know, was used for Marsiyas to recall the ordeal of the martyrs of Karbala, especially Imam Hussein, during the month of Muharram. And ghazals, so they were very popular. It was very popular style at the time, but they were also used for requiems at funerals. So as the poet Salik explained in the preface of the anthology, if you look carefully, every musaddas is an elegy and every ghazal is a requiem. And in the anthology, you can really see the way poets compared Shera Shob to Marsiyas. So they used the Shera Shobs to cry, but also make people cry. And here you have an example from Ish, explaining that in listening to this condition, whose heart is not breaking, etc. Another way they used to adapt the genre was that they used a poetry, an imagery of ruin and apocalypse. So they presented Delhi as a ruined garden with lots of description of the city of the past and the comparison with the present, with then and now images. So Sher Ashub used to be poems about the city, but now it became poems about the city of the past and the present decline. And here you can see an example of the images which were also used in Khaja Hassan Nizami's Khadar Dehli Kafsane, where you can see an image of the prince before and then the prince after, where he's turned into a beggar. So really there's a rupture here. You can see the same with the passages I've given you here. The trees of this prosperous garden have been trampled. The flowers of the gardens of the caliphate have been reddened with floods. So it's really the paradise which has turned into hell. And finally, the last way they transformed the genre is that they used a vocabulary that enhanced physical pain and scarring. So the emotional vocabulary deployed in the anthology is very rich, but one emotion dominated, which is grief. And the significance of grief is reflected by the richness of the vocabulary. I put here a bit of an image where you can see the different terms that have been used. But there are many words conveying sadness in the poems, which creates a very complex and broad affective web of sorrow. So Kham, Ando, Mayusi, Mustar, Alam, Ranj, Dard, Malal, Afsurdagi, Soda, Pareshani, Tang, etc. And the variety of words used for grief is remarkably broader in 1857 Sherashov than previously. So if we look attentively at the language used, we can see that grief is very much linked to the physical experience of pain, with many different body reactions being described. So tears, sometimes made of blood, being sick, eating or drinking one's heart and blood, tearing one's color to pieces, being pale, emaciated, etc. And one allegory that's really explains this suffering is the poppy. So in the collection, you have poppies often described, and also dar, which means the burn mark, the scar, which is imprinted on the heart. So dar also means sadness, shock, and grief at the loss of a loved one. And one traditional metaphor of this dar is the poppy. So the poppy is a suffering heart with the red evoking blood, and in the center you have the black, which evokes a burn. So you can see an example here from Safir where the flowers reflect the emotions of the poets, and in great agony the poppy drinks its own blood. So in 1857, the vocabulary of blood and tears, of organs being broken, cut to pieces, twisted, burnt, and eaten is graphic. It's really hearts transforming into kebabs. So Ham is nothing like a sweet sorrow or a mental state of depression, but an emotion linked with acute and physical pain and trauma. So Ham is really dotted here. Now, in the late 18, just wondering what those lines are. Mm-hmm. Not do anything about them. Okay, never mind. So in the late 19th century, Sherashob continued to be written on specific events. For instance, during the Russo-Turkish War or the Great Indian Famine in the late 1870s. But it was really used in the 19th century by the Aligarh movement. And this significantly differed from what Urdu partisans of the 1857 collection really differed from what Urdu partisans of the Aligarh movement emphasized 2 decades later. So just a bit of context, in the late 19th century, Urdu-speaking elites were under a lot of pressure with the establishment of competitive recruitment for government jobs, new mandatory qualifications, and the gradual establishment of elective government. And this opened public offices to new English profession graduates and increased the Urdu-speaking elite sense of urgency and the fear of lagging behind those who had been prompter to adapt to the new policies. So you see an emergence of a number of associations to address those new pressures, and the most impactful one was the modernist and loyalist Aligarh movement, founded by Syed Ahmed Khan in the 1870s, sorry. So its aim was to provide, I'm sure you all know about it, to provide English-style education to the Ashraf and reconcile Islam with Western sciences to help the Ashraf maintain influence and power in the colonial world. So while nostalgia might seem paradoxical with Aligarh's forward-looking project, the movement became famous for its grieving of the past. So almost every project of Syed Ahmed Khan was accompanied by the recitation of sorrowful verses or the memory of a glorious past in tension with a miserable present. And this continued to be practiced through the early 20th century when the Muslim League was created in 1906 and Aligarh leaders asked for political advantages from colonial authorities. And this sadness was cultivated by Syed Ahmed Khan and then his partisans. This was really at the heart of the movement. And I just quote you an anecdote which is really representative of this. It's that one night in 1872, one of Syed Ahmed Khan's close friends, Nawab Muftinul Mulk, explained that just before a meeting about the progress of education among Indian Muslims, he woke up and realized that Syed Ahmed Khan was not beside him. And he said, I'm quoting, "When I went out of the room in his search, I saw him pacing up and down the veranda. His eyes were filled with tears. I got worried and asked him whether he had received some bad news. On hearing this, he started crying even more. What great catastrophe can there be? The Muslims are ruined, and still they are following the path of destruction. After witnessing the condition of Sir Syed, I felt so much worried that I cannot describe it, and for me, admiration for that man became boundless. End of quote. So Syed Ahmed Khan's manifestation of grief overwhelmed Mohsin ul-Mulk to the point that it convinced him to dedicate his own life to the cause. So Mohsin ul-Mulk became a fervent supporter of Sir Syed and later one of the founders of the All India Muslim League. And this anecdote really hints at the power of emotions. They can be contagious and at the very basis of many collective and political endeavors. One of the most famous to express and to spread Syed Ahmed Khan's grief was Ali in his famous Musaddas on the Ebb and Flow of Islam, composed in 1878, on the encouragement of Syed Ahmed Khan, who wished that his tears would fall into the heart of mankind. So the Musaddas was to be a powerful tool to awaken the community through emotion and tears. And it used Sherashov motifs, the ruined garden, the Musaddas as a verse form, the glorious past and the present decline, and the significance of grief. So here I've put an example of the ruined garden of Islam. You can see the aesthetics really. So here it does not describe the city of Delhi, of course, but the glorious history of Islam around the globe and the contemporary decline of Islam in North India. So contrary to previous Sherashov, it activated different semantic webs and a different understanding of grief that built both on Sufi and medical tradition. So in contrast with 1857 poetry that emphasized physical pain, Aligarh writers correlated longing, regret, and repentance, so grief was linked to reform. So how did Ali and many others do that after him? So if we look at Ali's work more closely, we can notice that instead of linking Kham to the burning experience of separation, he conjured up a very different sense of Kham by evoking it alongside other terms like Hasrat, Afsos, Ranj, Majru, Sharm, or Zillat, as Syed Akbar Zaidi has recently explored. So regret, shame, and repentance. And in fact, shame and grief are described as desirable feelings. So Ali really tries to elicit both grief and shame in the poems because they are meant to lead to individual and collective reform. So here, Aligarh writers built on a Sufi understanding of sadness as a positive experience, a transforming emotion that led to the perfecting of oneself, since the experience of pain allows one to see the depth and value of life. And other colleagues of Ali expressed the same things, especially Nazir Ahmed, when he underlined the high value of emotion and of grief, when he said, it is in the order of this world that no human being is exempt from sorrow, and doubtless this has been so ordained by Providence, since if any person were happy in all respect, he would not remember his God. So here you see that Aligarh writers praised emotions for their ability to transform those who experience them. And this is why they try to elicit them in the audience. So Aligarh writers, and Ali specifically, explained that mourning the ruin of Indian Muslims was not enough. It needed to be acted upon. So Ali really says, "Humko kuch karna chahiye." You just can't just feel the emotion, but you need to do something about it. So the emotion or Josh needed to lead to action, not depression. And in fact, when a new edition of the Musaddas was published in 1886, Ali regretted the poem elicited despair. This was really not his goal. Depressive lethargy was criticized, and here it concurred with traditional Persian ethics, which associated grief with delusion and greed. So if you read Nasirian ethics from the 13th century, for instance, you can see that one must be content with what is available or adapt and not fall into depression. Otherwise, you need to be treated through diet, drugs, or even surgery. So the emotion was positive as long as it was transformative and led to self-reform. Otherwise, it was a disorder. So these ideas were extremely popular, and Urdu writers started lamenting regularly on the decline of India and the need for reform, so much so that it became the hallmark of Aligarh partisans. And increasingly, Ashraf identity was associated with grief, and you have a profusion of lamentation poems, often titled Komi Marsiya, Komi Musaddas, reflecting this. But other groups also started using the same discourse for propaganda and for encouraging Western-style education. So Kayast and Kashmiri Brahmins also wrote Ashok-style literature, and we have also instances of such poetry written by other groups who identified with the emotional practices of the elite in attempts at upward social mobility in the colonial world. So, for instance, you have a newspaper in the early 20th century that noted that though the Jats community are in a very depressed condition, it is gratifying to note that they still have some of the prototypes of their illustrious forebears. We should therefore bear in mind the following poem, and here follows a Sherashov style poem, and learn to hope for the educational future of our community. So you can see how this discourse was adopted by many. Now, unsurprisingly, the identification of Kham with a specific and elitist community also became an object of controversy. So the political implications of the practice most noticeably materialized in 1888 as the Indian National Congress was preparing its annual session in North India. So before that, it was in other places in India, but it was the first time in 1888 that it was supposed to be taken place in Allahabad, so in really UP. And the anti-Congress propaganda intensified. So the Indian National Congress was increasingly successful among the Urdu-speaking Ashraf, and it asked for open examinations, it asked for elective governments, and it clashed with the political aims of the Aligarh movement, which was supposed to work to maintain the political influence of traditional elites. So you see in 1888 a propaganda between a debate between Aligarh partisans and pro-Congress partisans, and it also took the shape in a magazine like the Awadh Punch, which was pro-Congress, to a poetic battle over a 2-month period between Aligarh and Congress partisans. And here you can see that the Shera Show poetry was clearly branded Aligarhian by Congress writers who pastiched the language of their opponents to mock them. So here I put just a short extract, but you can see that they use exactly the same verses, just tweaking it a bit. So for instance, in the pro-Congress propaganda, it says that these people of nature, of course, these are the Aligarh partisans, are day and night engulfed in sorrow. They always remain surrounded by this worry, and then will become the slaves of the Bengali, etc. And the Aligarh writers said in response, it is true that all the nobles bear this worry, always they are surrounded by this grief, will become the slaves of the Bengalis. These low-born people are indeed cheerful. This will be the effect of the Congress. May God never bring such a time. So here, grief was emphasized as an emotion that created community belonging, serving to clearly delineate distinct political groups. So it was not an opposition between Muslims and Hindus, but between loyalist Aligarhians and nationalist Congresswallas, and between also the well-born and the low-born, supposedly. So for Aligarh partisans, to be well-born was to be an Aligarh partisan, and being an Algerian meant to feel grief. And we can see this we can see this process very much at stake, this process of social and emotional identification in Shok Kidwai's poetry, for instance, where he says in the same years, we are sick of grief, grief doesn't let us free, grief is sick of us, we don't let it free. And on the other hand, you have writers like Akbar el-Labadi, who were quick to denounce the hypocrisy of Aligarh leaders who manipulated collective emotions for their own vested interests. So here Akbar emphasized the discrepancy between the discourse and the practice. So they mourn decline, but actually they prosper. So our leaders in pain for the nation are guests of the rulers for dinner. In their suffering situations, it's strange they're not looking thinner. So at the same time as grief unified an Aligarh political community, it also served to exclude others, marking clear community boundaries of belonging. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not surprising that the question of the sincerity of emotion arose from adversaries who did not share the same valuation of grief. And this really underscores how emotions actively shape communities, both by creating solidarity and by excluding others who do not feel the same. And for the Avad Punch, Aligarh writers had nothing to be sad about, but in fact, if we look at what Aligarh writers said, grief was not supposed to be passive despair. It was supposed to be, on the contrary, imbued with energy and a drive for self-reform. So now the question of the sincerity of sentiments resurfaced in North India in 1913. In the early 1910s, a group of young Aligarh-educated Ashraf began distancing themselves from the loyalist stance of the Aligarh movement's older leadership, and they became increasingly critical of colonial policies, particularly after the annulment of the partition of Bengal in 1911. And at this turning point, the faction often referred to as the Young Party believed, in contrast to the old party supporter of Syed Ahmed Khan, that they could no longer depend on government favor. For instance, Nawab Vikarul Mulk made this shift explicit when he declared, "It's now manifest like the midday sun, after seeing what has happened lately, it is futile to ask the Muslims to place their reliance on government. What we should rely on, after the grace of God, is the strength of our right arm." So you can see the shift into a new generation who are no longer loyal to the government. And unlike the large land-owning elites that were making these old party Muslims, the young party Muslims were usually middle-class professionals. They were often employed in low-paid government service, and they were inspired by liberal reforms and ideas of popular sovereignty emerging from the West and the Middle East, especially Turkey. And they really began challenging the leadership of the newly founded All India Muslim League. And their influence gradually grew, culminating in their ascendancy in 1916 in the All India Muslim League. But already from 1911 onwards, Muhammad Ali Johar, who you can see here on the photo, was one of the most prominent young party leaders, and he used his newspapers, The Comrade and The Comrade in English and Hamdard in Urdu, to launch critiques of the old party's jeremiads of Islamic poets, as he said, so the style of poetry that was used before. And he said that India wants not reformers, but revolutionaries who would release the heart and mind of the people from the thraldom of the dead past and turn them confidently ahead. The nature of the appeal has to be completely changed. They should be roused to activity not for the sake of what they were, but what they can be. So you can see here how it how this shift was materialized. In 1912-1913, at the same time as you have the Balkan Wars, the young party leaders increasingly lamented on desecration of historical Muslim sites in India, and especially in New Delhi, as the government was constructing the new capital. And journalists started reporting regularly on attacks on the heritage of North India, and it was only intensified with the demolition of part of a mosque in the city of Kanpur in July 1913. After months of negotiation, on the 1st of July 1913, the UP government demolished the washing place of the Machli Bazar Mosque in Kanpur against the wishes of Muslim leaders like Muhammad Ali. So a road had been planned to be constructed in the neighborhood for several years, and it was supposed to affect both a Hindu temple and a part of the mosque. So here you can see the road being constructed, the temple just ahead of you, and the mosque in the back side on the right, sorry, with the washing place already demolished. Now, Hindu associations had expressed their discontent at the planning, and the authorities had eventually decided to spare the temple, but not the mosque. So here you can see the temple is it's still there because they tried to they made a sort of roundabout around the temple to please the Hindu associations. When Muhammad Ali exchanged letters with the Lieutenant Governor James Meston, on the topic, letters which were reproduced in the Comrade and which put oil to the fire. The latter had explained that while he judged Hindu feelings regarding the temple genuine, he believed Muslim grievance to be largely imaginary, exaggerated, and not wholly sincere. If there had been any doubt about its seriousness, he would have been most scrupulous to avoid anything which would wound genuine susceptibility, since he admitted that a deflection of the road to spare the mosque would have been a small matter. So you can see here how feelings and their alleged sincerity became again a point of contention. Since the end of June 1913, Muhammad Ali's newspapers insisted on the need for Muslims to express their true feelings, asli jazbat, to the authorities, and warned on emotional terms that we hope that for the beauty of streets, breaking the hearts of Muslims will not be permitted. And in fact, if the Land Acquisition Act of 1894 allowed for the destruction of religious sites, the Indian Penal Code of 1860 considered that hurting religious feelings was a serious offense, since they were likely to create riots and unrest. So much of the agitation thereafter aimed at displaying religious emotions, and especially grief. Many newspapers like Abul Kalam Azad's Al-Hilal started describing how the manifestation of the true feelings of Kanpur Muslims had been inhibited, and mass meetings started to spring up mid-July across British India. And as the agitation was going on, the morning of the 3rd of August, a group of Muslims filled with anguish at the sight of the desecrated portion of the mosque, or for the British, excited by the recitation of pathetic verses, started reconstructing the structure. So the police were called and shots were fired, and it killed 17 men. So soon after, newspapers reported on the incident as being the day of Ashura, so Imam Hussein's martyrdom at Karbala, linking the fate of Kanpur to that of Muslims around the world. It gave rise to speeches, articles, and poetry that heavily built on a vocabulary of innocence, martyrdom, blood, and poverty, but also hope and solidarity. And this, as Nandini Guptu has also shown, gained popular support not only among the Muslim Ashraf, but among the Muslim urban poor as well, notably the butchers, and of course, much, much less among the old generation of loyalist Aligar leaders. So if we look carefully at a very popular pamphlet by Khaja Hassan Nizami entitled The Bloody Tale of Kanpur, we notice an emphasis again on graphic portrayals of violence with descriptions of the dead and injured, orphans, wailing mothers, but this time, contrary to 1857, the blood of martyrs was also described as uplifting. So you can see here a poem from the pamphlet, and in the middle of the poem, you have a change, a sort of shift, where blood actually became wine in the cups of poppies, and then the light comes out and it is nourishing. It brings flowers to the community field, and it is the death from which the world is made alive. So the turning point in the poem is the transformation of blood into wine, into the cups of poppies. And here again, we see poppies coming back. And blood and tears are now exalted as fruitful and triumphant. In another passage in Hamdard, you have the same use of the aesthetics with, I think it's Maulana Muhammad Ali Johar saying this, so the destruction of Muslim monuments will make us weep. Yes, we will cry tears of blood, but they will not be useless. They will water the field of patriotism and will make the flower beds of fraternity bloom. So this again was another way of understanding grief and martyrdom. So here, instead of emphasizing despair, martyrs were depicted as victorious, as the ultimate divine lovers for whom death signifies union with God. So here you have martyrdom becoming the pinnacle of faith and truth. Suffering was what defined a true man, for only a true man could endure pain, and this idea resonated with the Sufi connection between mard and dard, so between man and pain. So grief here was not really agony, it was not regret as well, it was triumph, it was love, and it was faith. And other scholars have also shown that Imam Hussein became a symbol of the freedom struggle for Muslims and Hindus alike. So you have a recent book by Nishad Zaidi translating Premchand's Karbala, because it really became a symbol of the freedom struggle in the early 20th century. So in 1913, the collective expression of Muslim grief proved effective. So in October, the Viceroy intervened, the washing place was reconstructed, the government sought to reassure the subjects, hoping the incident would soon be forgotten. So Muslim grief was acknowledged. Yet, grief, and I will not go a lot beyond that, but grief and its public manifestation remains political. So in an April 1919 poem published in Lucknow, a certain Mahdi lamented, "The expression of grief is forbidden in this regime. We are suspected, our grief is suspected." So grief had truly become a threat to the authorities. So here you can see that for the young party leaders, grief and grievance were inseparable. This time decline was no longer an inward-looking call for self-reform. It was a weapon pointed at the aggressor. So Muslim suffering set against the state's indifference. So writers no longer dwelled on a glorious past, but on present injustice and oppression. And by identifying the colonial states as the source of grief, Its expression became a powerful tool for anti-colonial mobilization, forging solidarities among nationalists. And I just want to conclude with the last poem written by Muhammad Ali Johar in 1919 after a deadly riot following the Rowlatt Act demonstration in Delhi to kind of close the loop. He provocatively wrote a poem entitled Fukhan Dahli in allusion to the 1857 anthology. And in his poem, you can see that the aesthetic completely differed from 1857 poetry. He said here, if the declaration of faith is chanted by Delhi, never can be erased the name and trace of Delhi. So you can see how grief shaped different groups in the history of British India, at times strengthening community solidarity or fostering exclusion or prompting individuals to reform themselves or mobilizing against political enemies or even negotiate with the state. And I will stop here for now. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tignol. It was a very thought-provoking work that you have done, and how you have used different emotions from a historical point of view, and how emotions are seen mostly as primitive, and how we can actually bring out in a modern civilization. I would request Sumaiyah, our discussant for the day, to speak on the subject and the presentation. Over to you, Sumaiyah. Dr. Sumaiyah. Yeah.
Thank you very much. A very warm welcome to all the participants and the audience here. And thank you very much to Dr. Eve Tignol for presenting this wonderful book on the subject of grief and pain, and beautifully using the poetry in expressing the deep emotions as well as the what should I say, catharsis, how it has done among Muslims or the Muslim communities, and how it has shaped them. It brings the vibrant colors of all the events, or most of the events of pre-independence to post-independence India. And the subjects of grief or pain or sense of deep loss or wounded feelings and emotions or mourning are indeed rich and emotional threads to explore. And the period from in which this book has touched the time period has been from 1857 to post 1947 era, and this was not only a politically charged time period in India with the first war of independence in 1857 through to independence in 1947, but it was also an era of deep cultural, personal, and national grief, as well as an intense nostalgia, both for a pre-colonial past and for a future free of colonial rule. In this highly charged emotional time of grief and pain emerged the poetic the poetic expressions or genre, which was known as Shehr Ashob. It is a unique genre of classical Urdu poetry that literally means the city's the turmoil of the city, or the ujdi bastiyan, as we say in Urdu. It emerged as a powerful literary form in the 18th and 19th century in North India, especially during times of social upheaval, political instability, and moral decline, often in response to invasions, famines, or the fall of empires. And the key features to Shehr Ashob poetry was that it typically mourned the decline of urban centers, particularly Delhi. And it is also a form of social critique and personal and collective grief with vivid urban imagery, which forms the part of Shahr-e-Ashub. Famous poets of the Shahr-e-Ashub genre have been Mir Taqi Mir, Sauda, Shibli Nomani, and Hali. And lines such as Mirza Ghalib's उजाड़ दिया है तुम्हारी उल्फत ने सब नशा, और बहादुर शाह जफर्स लगता नहीं है दिल उजड़े दयार में, और हालीस वर्ड्स एज गमे दुनिया का होता इलाज कोई, और इकबाल्स एंटायर शिकवा एंड जवाब शिकवा, और फैज अहमद फैज़ ये दाग दाग उजाला, ये शब गजीदा शहर. All these poetic expressions have not been only the reflection of grief or pain, but the Shahr-e-Ashub poetry has also been about resistance through memory. By recording the collapse of cities and values, these poets preserved a cultural conscience. Today, scholars like our esteemed speaker of this evening, Eve Tignol, explored how such poetic expressions of grief help shape collective identities and fostered a sense of community among North Indian Muslims in the colonial period. She has discussed it thoroughly. In her book, Grief and the Shaping of Muslim Communities in North India, from 1857 to 1940s, she offers a profound exploration of how collective grief influenced the formation of Muslim identities and political movements in colonial India, drawing from a rich array of Urdu sources, including poetry, prose, newspapers, and personal correspondences. And as far as I have understood this through the initial work. I have not gone through the book as of now to honestly give my opinion, but I've gone through the preliminary work of PhD thesis of Eve Tignol, this book is the version of perhaps mostly the version of that research work which she has done in the PhD, and through that, key themes and insights which can be drawn are number one, grief as collective force, in which Tignol has argued that grief was not merely a personal emotion but a collective force that shaped Muslim communities. She traces the evolution of the Shahr-e-Ashub genre poems lamenting the devastation of cities from its focus on the destruction of Delhi post 1857 to broader expressions of loss and nostalgia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This transformation reflects a shift from mourning a specific event to articulating a collective sense of decline and aspiration as well for renewal. So the thing which I was saying that, dard ka dharma banana, the process of catharsis which has happened through these poetic expressions has formed a very interesting a part of this work. Emotional vocabulary and political mobilization can be seen in this book, and this book dwells into the semantic richness of the Urdu term gham or dard, as our speaker has been discussing now, encompassing grief, nostalgia, humiliation, and longing for a free country or a free place, free land. It demonstrates how poets and writers employed this emotional lexicon to critique colonial rule and envision political future. For instance, in the 1880s, the Aligarh movement utilized gham to foster a sense of pan-Islamic solidarity, which forms a proper chapter of the book or the thesis. And while in the 1920s, poets like Muhammad Iqbal transformed grief into a revolutionary call for resistance through his work in Shikwa and Jawab Shikwa, in which he turns on everybody with the words like खुदी को कर बुलंद इतना कि हर तकदीर से पहले खुदा बंदे से खुद पूछे बता तेरी रजा क्या है. So apart from this, the subject of memory, nostalgia, and identity has also been examined in this book. How nostalgia for a lost Mughal past was informed through the writings of Muslim elites in Delhi has been highlighted, and how this longing for a bygone era served as a means to maintain cultural community and resist the erasure of Muslim heritage amidst the colonial modernization. Takes the important place of this subject or of this book, and these are roughly the areas which I could explore. However, I have also felt that maybe other critiques on the work might have also felt that the term of gham, is it fully explored or is it still questionable? Because gham, in the sense of the what should I say, Ashura, in the mourning of the Karbala event, similarities with that form of gham, can it be the only form, or there are other Muslim traditions such as Deobandi, Barelvi, and Ahmadiyya to the events of 1857, and their expressions of grief, are they also formed? Do they also form some sort of expressions? These are a bit less explored areas, which I have felt from the reading, and exploring these perspectives could offer a more inclusive understanding of the diverse emotional landscapes within Muslim communities. So maybe I could stop with here, concluding the discussion by saying that this book, Grief and the Shaping of Muslim Communities in North India, is a significant contribution to the study of emotional history and South Asian Muslim identity. By highlighting the role of grief in community formation and political mobilization, the book offers valuable insights into the ways emotions have historically shaped collective action and identity. Here, I would like to stop my discussion, and it would be more fruitful if there are questions and discussions from the participants and uh, with our wonderful speaker as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sumaiyah, for this wonderful and very generous um, overview. Yes, you're completely right. I haven't looked into the Deobandis and other forms, other groups of Muslims. I focused more on the mainstream public sphere, and these were dominated by Aligarians and pro-Congress. But of course, when you deal with the late 19th and especially early 20th century, the amount of source material that you face is so big that I had to kind of constrain myself to what I could lay my hands on, and I didn't include those groups. And I definitely, this is more, I feel like this book is more a first step into the direction of looking further into other forms of grief, other expressions, and it should be more inclusive as well, as you say. It's a very good critique. I may add as well that the gender aspect of grief was not treated in this work as much as I would have liked it to, because again, my corpus of source material was more on the male public sphere, and hence I haven't touched about the more feminine maybe expressions of grief, which might be very different from what has been said in the book. But now that I'm working more on female magazines. I'm hoping to kind of fill that gap a little, but definitely this book is really a first step, but I'm more happy to delve into more stuff or even invite you to explore more writings as well. Thank you so much for this review.
Thank you, Dr. Tignol. If anyone has any questions or they want to raise any comments, they are free to either type at the chat box or they can raise their hands. I completely, throughout the presentation, I was focusing on the gender aspects, which you just now addressed. That's something I found that, it could have been given more of an inclusive approach. Besides that, I understand that the work is from an historical background. It's more from a history and how it has been shaped in a colonial era. But if we try to see in the contemporary times right now, the literary aspect of Urdu has gone away to a great extent. So, how we see the shaping of that Muslim community in contemporary context, like in today's context, what are the narratives that would be? Suppose if we want to, explore the narrative of griefs, explore those emotions, take emotions in a form of, as a performative in the contemporary situation. How would you like to see that, especially what is happening, especially after independence till now? There has been different eras, different political development, different involvement of Muslims in a different era. But over the period of time, there has been a huge decline of Urdu literary work. And today's hardly anyone, especially if you go in the mainstream education or a mainstream knowledge, you will hardly find people, focusing on these kind of literary work. So, what kind of impact will it have on shaping of the Muslim community in today's context, right? And if it's gonna have a declining or deteriorating impact, so what are the other alternatives that we can look upon, and how we can function on, because like you said in your presentation also, Urdu is mostly seen as a Muslim language, or is a language which is mostly based on North Indian Muslims. So, and that language has erased over the period of time. Very hardly, even in the Muslim communities as well, people are more focused on the language that they learn from the schools or other media. And someone who has learned Urdu, either they are from madrasa's background or the background which is completely dominated by the religious understanding. So, how would you like to challenge those in this contemporary times? Since I am not a historian by training, so I would like to bring your focus into into more of on the contemporary times. So that's what I was curious to know about.
Thank you so much, Azima, for this. It's always difficult for a historian to say what will happen in the future
Yeah.
or even comment on the present, because what I focused on in the book is certain communities, certain expressions, and I didn't want to give the impression that there was just one direction for the expression of grief, but on the contrary, multiple voices and multiple practices, which sometimes clashed between them. I think Shereshab continues to be written either in Urdu or even in Hindi. We had with the COVID crisis as well, lots of poems, mourning the present decline, even sometimes mourning the way politicians dealt with the crisis as well. I'm thinking about one poem in the UP, about the UP government. I can't remember the name exactly, but there were poems written on present crisis. In Pakistan, of course, you had also poems in Urdu being written on Ziaul Haq rule, also on military operations in Karachi, for instance, in the 1990s. So Sharasho can be still employed by various communities. I don't think it's an aesthetic that is constrained in the Urdu sphere, I think it can be adopted in different languages as well. And I think Hindi might be one of them as well. I don't think Muslims are necessarily associated with Urdu. I think Urdu can take very different shapes and forms, and even being written in Devanagari, for instance, it's still something that people can practice, not linked to any religious affiliation. But I think emotions more generally can be used for community boundaries and community mobilization. I think it's not only grief, but any emotions really. You can mobilize around anger, for instance. You can mobilize around fear or around any type of emotions. It really depends how it's used, and I would need to kind of analyze different discourses to see whether we can see trends coming up. But I think it's interesting because nowadays I've got the impression that Urdu, the grief for Urdu, is something that Muslims kind of share. And what is done with it is really interesting as well. So I know that Urdu is less and less practiced, of course, but you can also have new impulse being put in Urdu, and the Rekhta Foundation, for instance, does a great work at reviving or putting forward Urdu literary works. But even then, I feel like there's this loss for Urdu that is being mourned by Muslims. I would say North Indian Muslims more generally. But I think it depends on the places as well. I wouldn't say that there's one emotion for all the Muslims in India, because locality is a very important um, marker as well as community belonging. So it's I don't think it's the same for North Indian Muslims from Kanpur as it is for, I don't know, Kerala Muslims, for instance. So you really need to think about locality as well. And yeah. But Shara should continue to be written, and I think Hindi can also adapt to Urdu aesthetics, even if it's not the same script. But still,
Yeah, that's true. Is there any other question? You can raise your hands or type their question in the chat box. There was one question earlier. I can't see that person right now. Okay. It seems there hasn't been no hand so far, and my voice is almost gone, so it's having quite some difficulty in speaking as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Eve. That was a very thought-provoking talk, and the book. It is a very interesting read, and the way you have figured out that there's a gender aspect, special needs, because that's one of my first question, and that you addressed it earlier. That is something which I might be looking forward to in your next or upcoming work. And the way you have dealt, and also the way you talked about there are the different communities that need to be more inclusive in the world. That is something, but somehow I feel you have laid down the foundation of how you have used the grief as an emotion in shaping different in the community. So I think this can be used as a tool or as a source for the future research, especially in a historical domain. So thank you so much for this wonderful session. And I'm sure everyone who has been part of this conversation, who has been part of this discussion, will definitely go back and read this book and try to understand the in-depth and thorough understanding of the grief that you have explored in your book. And thank you for accepting the invitation to be part of CSPS and presenting this session to us and taking out time for that. So thank you so much, Dr. Eve. And I would like to thank Dr. Sumaiyah as well for such a thorough discussion and the way she has provided her narratives and inputs on the whole discussion. That was again, that was an icing on the cake. Like, so that the combination has, gave us a very thorough and a very elaborative understanding that how one has to look into the historical perspective to understand, because I am being a political scientist, I'm more focused from a sociological and political aspects from a current perspectives. But until unless we don't understand the historical side of it, we don't have that clarity, it will be difficult to come to a contemporary understanding. So thank you so much, Dr. Sumaiyah, and thank you so much, Dr. Eve, to present this kind of discussion. And actually, especially at this time, we're talking about this, talking on these issues as becoming quite challenging, especially in India. So thank you so much for daring or trying to speak out of working on such a important issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you all of you for coming, and especially to the CSPS for organizing this. And I wish I was in Delhi right now and meeting
Yeah,
you all in
I
person,
wish
but
we,
hopefully next time.
yeah, hopefully we can have one event once you are in Delhi as well. We could have an interaction then and there as well. That would be a great as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us for today's enriched and thought-provoking discussion. On the behalf of CSPS, myself, Mohammad Zaid, Program Officer of CSPS, I extend our heartfelt gratitude for Dr. Eve Tignol for sharing the insights from her remarkable book and for taking us through the effective landscapes of grief, memory, and Muslim community formation in colonial North India. A sincere thank you to Dr. Sumaiyah Ahmed for her incisive reflections and for bringing a comparative and gendered lens to the conversation. We are also deeply grateful to Dr. Azima Salim for so ably chairing today's session and for her thoughtful engagement with the text and its broader context. Your contributions today have not only illuminated the book's themes, but also expanded our ways of thinking about emotion, identity, and historical narrative in South Asia. And finally, thank you to everyone in the audience for your time, your questions, and your continued support for conversations that push the boundaries of scholarship and public thought. We look forward to seeing you again at future CSPS events. Thank you all for joining. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.